The global war on drugs has now been in motion for over 6 decades. Recent studies by the United Nations and other global think tanks, however, reveal that the war on drugs has failed to meet its goals. In India, the NDPS Act, introduced in 1985, is the main legislation against drug use and trafficking. The Act imposes imprisonment or fine on anyone who's found guilty of consumption of any narcotic or psychotropic substance, irrespective of the quantity or the kind of substance. The penalties for possession of such substances vary dependent upon the quantity and type. Critics argue that the harsh penalties harm personal users and harass small producers more than any big trafficking rackets in India. Advocates for legalizing cannabis use the natural properties of the drug and its socio religious sanction as an important factor in its legalization. Supporters suggest that legalization of drugs would enable the government to control the quality of the product and prevent harmful laced substances from entering the market. It could also support the creation of more jobs and would lead to an economic boost through increased taxation and benefit the small farmers and business that could legally be regulated. The NCB, however, warns against these superficial benefits and calls them surface level. While India continues the violent task force interventions to stop such drugs from entering the society, the numbers of users continue to rise. An open and comprehensive public debate on India's drug policies is much warranted. Does the drug war need to be harsher and stricter to penalize the violators and perpetrators of the drug trade? Or would a softer approach towards rehabilitation and decriminalization lead to more positive results? As different countries reassess their response to the rampant drug use, overdose deaths, and spike in imprisonment, what should India's stance be? Welcome to the Argumentative Indians. Joining us on the panel today are Ms. Tripti Tandon, lawyer and deputy director with the Lawyers Collective, Dr. Vikram Singh, former Director General of Police UP, Mr. Abhishek Mohan, founder and CEO at Hemp Street, and Dr. Atul Ambekar, professor at the National Drug Dependence Treatment Center at AIIMS. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel today. To begin with the discussion, I would like to invite Dr. Ambekar to present his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you indeed for having me here this evening. The title of our discussion today itself, War on Drugs, is supposed to be a very catchy kind of title, springing everyone into action, conjuring an image of some bad guys being sort of fought against, being killed, being injured, being hurt by very brave security forces. You know, that kind of image is conjured. Now, how does this actually come from? This philosophy, this attitude of looking at drugs as evil, bad, something which must be fought and destroyed, actually emanates from the philosophy where you see drugs as primarily a law and order, criminal justice, or a national security type of issue. The truth is, use of all psychoactive substances, including what we call as narcotics or psychotropics, is primarily not a law and order or criminal justice system issue. It's primarily a health and welfare issue. So it's really a kind of a mental health issue by which the perspective of which we need to see this problem. Now, at the heart of this attitude of declaring a war against drug actually emanates from the legacy of colonialism and racism. Back in 1950s, 1960s, the truth was the drugs or substances which were used by the global south, the developing countries in the global south like us, the brown colored people, you know, the brown and black colored people, the substances which we have been using were considered bad and evil by the white colonial forces, while the substances they used to produce and enjoy, such as tobacco and alcohol, they came to be not just accepted and tolerated, but even eulogized, celebrated, promoted. And the effects are something on the health and welfare are something which we can see right now. So essentially, the drug war attitude comes from the attitude where we think that what I use is okay, what you use is bad and must be destroyed. And that's where it actually comes from. Had we been more rational, more pragmatic, and more evidence based in our philosophies, in our attitudes towards drugs, perhaps things would not have come to this pass. So essentially, we need to have a overhaul. We need to rethink once again, what are these psychoactive substances, how best to deal with them. I coined the phrase, I proposed the phrase, not war on drugs, but make peace with, with the drugs. So in other words, we need to find the best way the society can have a manageable relationship with the drugs. Drugs are here going to stay. Humanity is going to stay here. It's a human need to consume one or the other psychoactive substances. Let's find out how best we can use these substances, minimizing the harms and maximizing their benefits, which they have, the potential which they have to offer. So I'll stop right now here, and I'll come back again with elaborating more on these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ambekar. And it's interesting that you bring up this perspective where drugs can be looked at is not a purely law and order problem, but from a more perhaps peacemaking health, mental health, and physical health problem. But then the situation still remains that we do have legislature around drugs, we do have law and order around drugs, and there are crimes interrelated with drug consumption. So I would also like to bring Dr. Vikram Singh here to bring in his expertise from his own personal experience and professional perspective. Sir, you're on mute. Please unmute.
Thank you, Arzu. Words of profound wisdom from Dr. Atul Ambekar ji. Salutations to you, sir. Arzu, yes, I have my own reservations, but the fact of the matter is that there cannot be cut and dried solutions to this issue. There are multiple dimensions to the problem. Historically, we in India have been consumers ganja and bhang. It is difficult to find a single place that is our so-called pilgrimage where you do not have bhang being consumed in en masse and openly. Then the use of cannabis sativa, openly available. Then we also have in India what is known as a caste system. Unfortunately, there's a caste system that those who consume drugs are the untouchables of today. But the ground reality is, go to any school. I live in the NCR area. You go to any school, it is difficult to find a single school, college, or any such place where there is a large population available and drugs are not insidiously available. So if you observe the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, the strength is that we have one of the most stringent laws in the country, Ndps Act 1985. That is the strength. The weakness is, have we been able to put to use or optimum or appropriate use? I'll reserve my comments because there are illustrious panelists who would know immensely better than I would. But I, as a former police officer and as a citizen of this India, terribly disappointed by the way Ndps Act has been used, misused, abused, and the appropriate use is still missing. You have to be cruel to be kind. It is not for me to go and speak in superlatives about the Ndps Act. But the only question is, confiscation of illegitimate property, proceeds of crime, and also death penalty. Have we seen even one after 1985? And if not, I will go into the details of what the horrific convictions and the horrific acquittals are. And this is when it comes to a specialized Narcotics Control Bureau. It is not the question of a single police station. It is the question of an elite organization having the best brains of investigators. And yet, if we are able to get just 20% convictions, there's something horribly wrong with the whole story. I will go into detail later. This was the weakness. Opportunities, you very elaborately mentioned that if we were just to, because it is impossible for law enforcement alone to handle this Garangutan problem. It is impossible to say that the police can single-handedly solve it. No, it has to be a public and private partnership. There is no other solution. There have to be people like Ms. Tandon, the people like Professor Ambekar, the people like Mr. Mohan, people like you, Arzu, who have to chip in and put the best foot forward. The threats, Pakistan is sending drone loads of drugs and narcotics. In Gujarat, we have had a record haul of narcotics going into crores and crores of rupees. If a sizable chunk of our population is doing drugs, That is the threat. We will, of course, go into every aspect, Arzu, but during the course of the debate, thank you so much for giving this vibrant platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh. And it's interesting how you brought out the NDPS Act as a strength that we have in our legislation, and the weakness lies in the execution of it. So perhaps strict laws against drug use, or perhaps strict legislation against it, is or could be a strength for the country, but what about the execution of it? Thank you for bringing that up. I would also like to invite Ms. Tripti Tandon to share her remarks.
Thank you, Arzu. I want to make a couple of points. I think the first is that the reality is that the war on drugs has failed. Whether it is globally or in India, you read the World Drug Report year after year, and this year's report also shows that there's a phenomenal increase in the production, in the supply, and the use of all narcotic and psychotropic substances. If you take India, so in 1985, over 30 years now with the NDPS Act, the most draconian, and sorry, Professor Vikram, it's actually 80% conviction rate under NDPS as per official government data. And yet drug use in the country has only increased. Seizures have increased, supply has increased, what Professor Vikram said about Gujarat and other border states. Let's take the state of Kerala itself, where drug crimes constitute about 20% or 16 to 20% of all crimes reported in the state. 90% of cases are against people who use drugs, and yet only 2-3 days ago, I think the Chief Minister said, drug use is on the rise. We need to do something with our young people. So it's clear the war on drugs has failed. Not only has the war on drugs has failed, it has also wreaked havoc on individuals, families, and societies. World over, 1 in every 5 person is incarcerated because of a drug offense. And of that number, about more than 80% are people arrested on account of personal use and possession. India is no different. There are countries like Thailand, which have waged a war on drugs for decades. More than 80% of the prison population is there on account of drug offenses. And people with as small as 3 meth tablets serving 15-20 years of prison time. So, and behind each person who's incarcerated, there's a family. Only yesterday, I finished completing a petition for a case for a client who's been inside for nearly 5 years now, not got bail. He was simply carrying. He's a truck driver. He was carrying a couple of gunny bags of ganja. If I calculate on the basis of the police's case, how much has he made? The so-called, people who profit from drugs, he has made 16 rupees for every 1 kilo of ganja. 16. This is as per what the prosecution claims he has profited. So, and he has a family, his elderly parents, he has 4 young children. What happens to them when these people remain in prison for years altogether? And also, let's remember, in our country, 58% of the NDPS cases are against people who use drugs. Many of them are drug dependent. Is prison the way to help them out? Is prison the way to offer them a better life? I don't think so. So my third point really is that if there is something which is ineffective, not working, and also damaging, it's a moral imperative that we explore alternatives. And all the more I say so, because now it is the UN, the very UN that has made us all introduce prohibition. UN entities are now saying, let's have a relook. Let's not criminalize everyone involved in drugs. Let's have a proportionate human rights-based response. Countries that have led the war on drugs, whether it is the US or even Thailand now, are changing course. They are experimenting with legal regulation. And I'm not saying that we adopt all of that immediately, but at least let's be open to the idea to study, examine, and explore. These are not theoretical possibilities. They are very real models that countries around the world, including our neighborhood, are implementing. And the last point I want to make is about India. I mean, you pose a question whether India will actually be ready to end the war on drugs. I'm unfortunately very pessimistic, because if you see across political parties, whether it is the right-wing parties or, left-wing Kerala, drug war resonates across, the political spectrum. And for any situation, any problem, the answer is, let's revamp the drug war. Let's make it even more stringent. Let's criminalize lots of other people. And unfortunately now the war on drugs, the NDPS Act, is also used to settle other scores, nothing to do with drug use, but extraneous factors. And then there's the element of the police, extortion, bribery, which is rampant. If you want to escape the clutches of the draconian law, if you have money, there's certainly a lot that you can do. So what I'm saying is that while I don't think we are in a state practically, reality is that we're not going to end the war on drugs very soon, but I think we can take incremental steps to soften the blow and maybe have a more evidence and science and rights-based response, which I'd be happy to allude to during the course of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tandon. And I think it really resonates with what also the panelists earlier have said, that it's at the heart of it, it's the individual also, and the way you brought up the nuances of, the justice system or the criminal system, the facts of incarceration of people who have consumed drugs or have dealt with drugs. So it's pretty interesting, and we would love to dwell deeper into these aspects. Mr. Mohan, I would also like to invite you for your remarks.
Hi, Arzu. Thanks for having me. And I absolutely don't claim to be an expert in whether the law enforcement part or the state of the NDPS Act as an expert on legality. But I just wanted to share what we've been able to do at Hemp Street and as an industry, how we've organized over the last few years, primarily with, I would say, the patients in mind, right? So I won't talk about the entire spectrum of narcotics that is being enforced under NDPS. I will talk about cannabis because that's what we have done extensive work in. Now, if you look at it from the perspective, of the patient, right? The idea is cannabis has medicinal properties that could alleviate a lot of mass ailments, especially the ones that we've gone after as an industry, whether it's dysmenorrhea or things that rob you of your quality of life. Now, you could say like what the most of the Western world looks at us as a pre-legalization market. They say, oh yeah, you guys are pre-legalization. But the reality is that we are federally legal under Ayurveda to prescribe via a registered medicinal practitioner to a patient. Now, are we able to sell online freely like in Colorado or in California? I think those are very different fights, right? In our case, we built this company, and I think most of my colleagues in the industry built it because there's an unacceptable level of mass ailments, largely around chronic pain, that spills into all other aspects of life. Whether it's, if you look at the typical Indian family, I'm sorry to give you this background because I just want to kind of tell you where we come from. The typical Indian family does not, live with a background like this, and there's about 7 members of the family living in one room, and you add to that, dysmenorrhea, or menstrual cramps that doesn't let women work, that doesn't, it robs you of quality of life, or sexual wellness, which is a big male ego problem in India, especially in rural India, where somehow it's everybody else's fault except ours, right? So you add that, if you do an empirical study and you do a regression analysis between that and domestic violence, because now you have these kind of people suffering mass ailments in a compressed environment, you will find a strong correlation. And now if you have children born in that environment, you've robbed them of maybe 30% of their potential at the onset. Now we said, how do you solve these mass ailments around chronic pain? Yep, the regulation is where it is. Yes, you cannot grow, you have to, receive your, raw material from the excise department. It's highly regulated. You get it based on what you manufacture. So in our case, what we did is we realized what is the best way to get safe access for patients while accepting what regulations are in place. So today we built a blockchain-based tracking mechanism. So we only sell to doctors. We don't do online prescriptions. We don't, it's not very good for business, but it is the best way to use within the purview of the current regulations to provide what's best for the patient. So that's kind of the perspective I wanted to bring to the debate. Now, whether to it's not that black and white. I mean, you have several substances affect in different ways. I understand meth in the Philippines, where I live between India and the Philippines, has gone through a phenomenal drug. I mean, a huge amount of, I can't comment too much about it, but it's a public forum. But, they have their own drug war that just kind of tempered down now, and largely against shabu and meth, right? And the example of cannabis is that you have the kind of Colorado model where they said, you know what, do what you want. It's recreational, which has its own. I mean, everybody's free to ask for what they want, but we've seen the downsides of that, and you've seen countries like Israel that have gone very deep into medical, into research, clinical validation. I think on the medical side, that's very important. India provides a federally legal environment, of course, under the stress of the Ndps Act, but you have to kind of do the work to make sure, is it securely, is the supply chain secure? Are patients getting what's best for them? Is it clinically validated? So I think when I talk about liberalization of this sector, it would be to provide more funding towards research, more, and I think the healthcare aspect on rehab, I think for users, yes, I agree that rehab and rehabilitation and it's a healthcare problem. But in our case, I think what support we would look from the government is that there should be the same way allopathy or all other kind of R&D funding happens freely, and we should have institutions working towards clinical validation around medicinal cannabis. I mean, that's the only thing I think I'm qualified to comment on. So that's my position. My position is that provide the infrastructure to provide what's best for the patients. Now, on the narcotics element, on drug addiction, on the trafficking, I don't think I'm the best person to comment on that. I think we have extremely experienced panelists for that. But I just wanted to bring this perspective that we are today in 25 states and 11,000 clinics, and we haven't had a mishap because we did the extra work to make sure that within this purview of regulation, we've managed to provide what we provide.
Right. So you bring in a pretty interesting perspective of how cannabis or other kinds of narcotics or psychotropic drugs could be used for people who are suffering from various ailments, and it could be an alternative form of health benefits, or it could offer alternative medication.
No, I mean, again, just a little point also, like we classify narcotics as whatever heroin and meth and cocaine and whatever ecstasy and everything. But you have the largest amount of abuse. If you look at what's killing people in the US, and is been off-label selling of prescription painkillers. If you look at the opioid crisis in the US, the amount of cost, it's a cost and the human cost of that has been phenomenal. And these have been legally manufactured, technically sold through chemist shops, but also made its way to the streets. You have similar crisis unfolding, and I would say in Punjab, we consume opioids at 3 or 4 times the average of the world. So I think there is that element that also, I guess at the end of the day, across the board, it comes down to how do you, even if you were to legalize or whatever, how do you ensure the integrity of the supply chain? How do you ensure in medical that there's no off-label prescription? Because opioids were manufactured by pharmaceutical companies. They were not made in a lab in underground in a forest in Colombia or whatever. They were manufactured by pharmaceutical companies, and they still made it out to kill tens of thousands of people in the US every year. I don't even know. In India, I don't think we have the infrastructure to deal with that kind of a crisis should it happen. So I think that's something also we kind of have to understand. I mean, that the idea is not the substance itself, but what effect it has on society, right? I mean, whether good, bad, abuse, whatever, but it has to cover the cost to the people, either the patient or the consumer. I think let's start from them and move backwards rather than defining that top-down kind of stuff. Yeah. Sorry, that's it. We may have lost Arzu.
I think Arzu has lost connection, and while she joins back, we can continue, I think, discussion. Arzu is back here. Right.
No, Dr. Ambekar, I think you should take over immediately without further ado.
Yeah, I think so. Basically, taking cue from what you said, and also taking cue from Professor Vikram Singh ji said about the NDPS inadequate implementation. We do not at this moment seem to be having the kind of injecting overdose crisis which North America is going through. And ironically, this is because of what Professor Vikram Singh ji was saying about inadequate and poor implementation of the NDPS Act. Let me explain. The Because of the opioid overdose actually occurs is much more likely when people inject drugs in a very high dose amount, which their body cannot tolerate. That's when they have a heavy intoxication, they lose consciousness, they may even die. In India, the majority of people who use opioids, they actually use heroin. And the majority of people who use heroin in India, an overwhelming majority, in fact, they use heroin by the smoking route, by what is called as chasing route. With that route, it's very difficult for a person to lose consciousness or to die. So death is actually correlated with the injecting route. And since our NDPS Act is very poorly implemented, the availability of heroin on the streets of India, which is very poor quality, very diluted heroin, which can easily be smoked, that remains unhindered. It continues to be available in India, and that's the reason why, while a lot of people are suffering from heroin addiction, a lot of them are not dying because they are not. They don't need to inject it. They are able to get it easily for the purpose of smoking it. Conversely, if the law enforcement suddenly comes down very heavily, if the supply of heroin is obstructed in India, that's when we have a potential that a lot of people who are currently smoking will shift to the injecting pattern of use. And once they inject, and once the more high potent forms of opioids they found entry into the illegal drug market, that's when the crisis of overdose may hit India also. So the poor implementation of the NDPS Act in terms of supply control of heroin may actually be inadvertently, unwittingly saving some lives in India by not leading to overdose crisis. So
Well,
that's one sort of a part of it.
well,
Another very interesting aspect. Let me just complete, and then I'll request you to come back. So another interesting point you made about the medical potential of using particularly the cannabis products. You are absolutely right. This particular plant actually may be very useful medically, and to a large extent the very research and development using the properties, medical properties of this plant has been hindered because of this prohibitionist attitude, because of this prohibitionist policies, because of the NDPS Act in India and similar laws in other countries. People have not been able to utilize the full potential of which cannabis has to offer. Today, I am not in a position to say whether cannabis works as a medicine effectively or not, or if it works, whether at what level of gradation should it be used by the medical practitioners, by the doctors. That's not the part of the debate, I suppose. I suppose we should be talking about how to make best the legal and policy environment which permits adequate research and use of cannabis in terms of its medical uses. So that's where I'll conclude here, and now you can continue, Abhishek ji, what you were trying to say.
So the opioid crisis in the US was engineered, I would say, by I don't know, the risk of lawsuits. A couple of very large pharmaceutical companies that have since been sued by several states, and they kind of they paid huge compensation. Now those same companies are under different names in India, dispensing pharmaceutical products, not injectables, pharmaceutical products, tablets, whatever brand, through that are easily sellable through some unscrupulous, chemist shops. And the reality is that chronic pain is it's an epidemic in India. India is the center of pain, they would say it. So people have, and living in squalor, people have little, options than to consume what is given to them, and that's looming. I mean, there is an opioid crisis looming primarily because people don't have access to adequate pain medication, and that's what happened in the US, right? I mean, you take opioids once, twice, and then you're addicted. It's for a minor thing. Doctors were prescribing it for whatever, and as a result, you had a massive addicted population. Now, India, and this is the US, right, where they have the ability to enforce, they have the ability to bust everybody, but in India we don't. And I think that's something that it's something that definitely needs to be looked into. Now, in terms of research for cannabis, the government does provide us, like, for example, CSIR is allowed to research on cannabis. We work closely with them, and we are moving towards the clinical validation process, me and my other colleagues from the industry, because that is the way forward. I mean, we are allowed to undertake that research, and that's happened very recently because we've been engaging the government. We've organized ourselves into industry bodies, because at the end of the day, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the government, whether it's the whole us and them, whether it's allopathy and Ayurveda, I think the us and them will never work, and it will never work for the patient, because you have people fighting over ideologies, but the patient eventually suffers. So I think that's something I wanted to touch upon, is that narcotics, I mean, the effect of on the medicinal, I would say, side is the way they're dispensed. So again, integrity in supply chain, providing what is really what people require, and clinical validation. I think if that is something that the government gets behind in a much stronger way, there will be manifold benefits.
Right. So I think we've gone pretty deep into understanding what are the health consequences for accepting drugs into the society, or for having more ease in the legislation and legalizing around drugs in our country. But I would also like to ask, I'd like to go back a few steps and ask how, the prevalence of drugs in our country is such that it is not purely related to healthcare. It is extremely deeply interconnected to also cross-border trade. It is also deeply interconnected to crime. It is deeply interconnected to trafficking. It is deeply interconnected to not just those small farmers or those small peddlers who are bringing drugs from one side to the other, but also the larger rackets perhaps that take place. So how do we understand that in terms of the legislation? Because I believe the legislation needs to be holistic, and it cannot have just one aspect to the entire drug problem. I'd like to hear Ms. Tandon's views on this.
I want to reiterate what I said earlier, is that the current framework is not working, whichever way you look at it, whether it is the objective of controlling drugs, reducing the illicit supply, or it is to regulate and make sure that patients who need, like Abhishek said, pain relief, they're also not getting it. So the current framework certainly is, has been a failure, and we need to explore alternatives. The question is, what should those alternatives be? Just some amount of research and studying and thinking that I've been doing, there are pros and cons of all sides. For instance, many people say that let's begin by decriminalizing, that people who use drugs should not be criminalized. Fair enough, that's achievable. But if you look at it from the criminal justice point of view, it means that the police then have the discretion, because even now it's the police who decides how much quantity I will charge you with. I charge you with small, okay, you'll get away sooner. I charge you with more. So as it is, the police enjoy a lot of power and discretion. And so look at studies and surveys done among people who use drugs, and they say we are very wary of police. Even now, it is up to them to decide whether they will slap the most draconian provision of the law, which is Section 27A, illicit financing, in a case or not. Because once that section is slapped, there's no way that you will ever come out on bail. And what they've been doing is selectively on certain people, I don't want to name them, imposing that provision, invoking it with a charge sheet, and then saying, okay, now you remain languish in prison forever. So any model that puts more power, gives more discretion to the police, I think in our country we need to be careful about. When it comes to, sorry, go ahead.
No, just to reiterate, are you saying that because the execution of the existing laws is not being done in a proper, in an ethical manner, the legislation then needs to be softer in order to compensate perhaps for the execution? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm trying to say is that there are, we have a framework which doesn't work. We have alternatives. But when we explore those alternatives, let's be clear of what the challenges are and what the challenges can be. Before we kind of jump to we should have this or that. If we were to have experiment with legal regulation, and in fact, that is something that India had in place for a long time, colonial, pre-colonial, we still have excise laws across states where it is theoretically possible to buy ganja, bhang, poppy in several places. We still have a system of registered opium poppy users, which is permitted under the Ndps Act, but of course now fallen into disuse because the government has not allowed it to prevail. So while legal regulation seems to be a more, a better method to control drugs, including their harms, again, it's, there are issues involved. Like, I can tell you from Canada, which has legalized cannabis, studies show that for a long time, the legally available cannabis was far more expensive than what was available in the illicit market. So people would still pursue the illicit channel until they kind of brought about parity and reduced prices. But with reduced prices, you're seeing, an influx. There's a lot of commercial companies and, big corporations who are entering that market, and the public health effects of those need to be understood, need to be seen. So I don't think anywhere we have, hit the nail and said we have a perfect model, but I think it's time that we at least be open to exploring be done. That will require us to acknowledge that the current system has failed and is not working. But I'm not sure whether we are there, because politician after politician just places trust in the NDPS and the war on drugs and says, we need to do more of this, though it's not working, in my opinion.
But if sort of in one statement, if you could say that as a lawyer and as someone who's practicing these legal frameworks on a daily basis, what direction do you think India needs to take? Does it need to be stricter or harsher in order to curb these kinds of crimes and this kind of drug menace? Or does it need to be softer? Or does it need to be a little lighter with regards to the punishments or with regards to the incarceration that's taking place?
I don't think stricter is going to be. It's fairly strict. It's the strictest law. It's even stricter than the anti-terror law that the Supreme Court has commented in a judgment. So I don't think that making it stricter is going to improve things. In certainly making it more human, making it more real, making it more sensible, practical, acknowledging the ground reality that people do experiment, they do use drugs. People who use, not all of them become dependent. Dr. Atul can explain that better. And introducing what I would consider very, very important, some judicial discretion, whether it is in deciding bail, whether it is in sentencing, whether it is in other measures. Because right now we have minimum punishment of 10 years. So anyone who's slightly above a certain quantity has to serve 10 years. Even if you're sick, even if you're a woman who was coerced by your partner into carrying drugs, or you were poor, none of these mitigating circumstances, which are ordinarily considered in the criminal justice system, have a place at the NDPS. And the suffering, the pain and suffering of individuals, families, communities is immense. And it's very easy to replace. You arrest one drug courier, there'll be 10 others, wanting to fill that role, because we are a, poor society. I mean, our economic opportunities are constrained. So let's be real about this. Yeah.
Dr. Vikram, this brings me to you, since you have been a very active part in the execution system and you have been an active part of governing a lot of these perhaps task forces or police action against drug menace, not just the crimes directly related to the trafficking of drugs or the consumption of drugs, but perhaps also crimes that stem out of drug use. So how would you respond to that?
There are multiple questions, Arju, which I have to respond to first. To Mr. Abhishek Mohans, there are international best practices in respect of cannabis. The experiment of Israel, Canada, Uruguay, and also Netherlands where cannabis is supposed to be sold legitimately licensed to tobacco and alcohol vendors. Well, that is debatable. Of course, I would not beg for it. Coming to laws, don't blame the law. We had the 13th Criminal Law Amendment Act amending the Evidence Act, the IPC and the CRPC. Has molestation and rapes gone down? To the contrary, there have been increased number of rapes and the convictions have come down. Now, jugglery of figures. To Mr. Tripti, I would say, I have relied on the NCRB data and also the Sunday Guardian, 23rd July, which says in 2020, 83,719 arrested and 16,117 just found guilty. It is just for the year 2020, it is 20% conviction. Then we go back to the year 2019. It is 72,721 arrests, 32,085 arrested. That is almost to the tune of 50%. Now there is a jugglery of figures. When you go to police stations, the conviction is almost 90%. But when it comes to the NCB, the conviction rate varies. So before we see which statistics are we looking at, narcotics and substances, when they're recovered at a police station, the conviction rate is almost, because everybody indulges in what is known as a confession made. Yes, I was found with so much, and then he is branded, and the police records of every police station in the country have the name of such person, and they are known in a contemptuous manner. I'm sorry for that. Smakia. As I said before, there's the caste system. Now tell me what has gone wrong with the Ndps Act. Ms. Tandon was absolutely proper and polite, not taking the names. I have no such compulsions. I take you all to Mumbai. Riya Chakravarti case, an absolute mess. Aryan Khan, an absolute mess of the case. Sushant Singh Rajput, an absolute mess of the case. If the premier investigating agency goes and looks upon the cases which were the cases of the decade, if not of the last quarter century, and if they're not able to get proper convictions and proper arrest or convincing charge sheets, well, there's something horribly wrong with the investigation. And what is horribly wrong with the investigation? Put your own house in order first. The principal investigator, there were certain allegations. I would not like to cloud your judgment, but investigation has the same sanctity as the legal proceedings, and the integrity cannot be compromised. I have my own reservations about the investigators and also the quality of investigation, and I'll stop at that, because then I would be treading on very dangerous territory, and I would stop at that. At the same time, there are things that a word to the wise is enough. A police officer should look like a police officer. An NCRB investigator, a Narcotics Control Bureau investigator should look like a Narcotics Control Bureau officer, not like a flamboyant film star. I hope the hint is loud and clear. Now we come to the facts that if most of your high-profile cases are falling flat in the court of law, there's something horribly wrong. And has there been a single case when such acquittals happen? There is a system, that is the internal system. What went wrong that ended in the acquittal? Was there an acquittal report? And if the acquittal report was prepared, did you identify the investigator and the prosecutor? And were there consequences for the investigator and the prosecutor? And if there were no consequences for the investigator and the prosecutor in the last 10 years, well, I have nothing to add.
Sir, I'd like to just stop you here, because I think we're going in a direction of police reform, and that is a completely different conversation that is very important to have. But bringing the conversation back to the issue of drugs and the issue of legalizing drugs in our country, I would like to ask you the question, sir, that not with specific cases, but with the society in general, when it's sort of more accepted that, yes, people will take drugs. It is something that we all just do. It is something that youngsters want to explore. It is something that is prevalently available in the market, and also sanctioned largely with a lot of social and religious movements. So in such cases, how does the police or how does the executive bodies or the authorities then manage the drug issue? Again, the question that I asked Mr. Tandon, I would ask to you again. What direction do you think the country needs to take? Does the country need to go in a stricter direction, or do we need to be a little more lenient with the execution of these laws?
Police officers, by and large, barring honorable exceptions, are reported to be wooden-headed and do not take any change very, very positively. Therefore, if you ask any police officer, the 99% say Well, the rule of law is supreme, and we do not accept the entry of any drug addict. These were the words. I'm sorry for being harsh. But the ground reality is, after having served in the police for 36 years, seeing the ground reality, I would say that the time for change has come to let fresh air be there. And also things that you could not do starting from the Victorian era, right up to today, starting from the Opium Act, when you had 2 opium factories in Uttar Pradesh, Ghazipur and Barabanki, you could do nothing, have opium shocks. You had Excise Act and the opium district opium officers. You could do precious little to contain the menace of drugs. If, in spite of Ndps Act 1985 and its 3 amendments, we have not been able to achieve much, the time has to take a relook, restructure how best. And the only success stories in the world have been where there has been public-private partnership with the help of medical doctors, NGOs, and also there are mental health issues that need to be addressed also. It has to be taken very, very holistically. To perhaps relegate it only as a police problem would be quoting the recipe of disaster, and I would be barking up the wrong tree if I feel that the police department in not only India, in any country, is equal to the task of removing the drug menace. Well, I would be living in a fool's paradise.
Right. So perhaps there needs to be a holistic approach, but then I'm also wondering that any sense of leniency in this matter or any sense of legitimacy to the consumption of drugs or the trade of drugs might just, open the gates for a lot more drugs to enter into the market. And I'm also wondering, Dr. Ambekar, you could shed more light on this, but if a youngster starts to experiment or starts to explore drugs, maybe with college, with friends, and if that goes wrong, there are high chances that the person could end up taking a lot more harmful drugs and be drug dependent eventually, if there is not that particular law enforcement or if there is not that regulation of the drugs. So, Dr. Ambekar, if you'd like to address that.
Yes, thank you. I'll begin by reiterating what Tripti was also saying. I concur with this view that one of the major problems with the NDPS Act and other similar laws is that they criminalize the act of consumption as well. So in effect, the example I like to say is that since drugs can destroy your lives if you continue taking them for 10 years, even if you have taken them once, allow us to arrest you and put you in jail so we can destroy your life today. That's what we are doing, in fact, with people who consume drugs. There is this very popular misperception that a fear of arrest or criminal charges will act as a deterrent. And because of that fear, people will not experiment, people will not take drugs. The research conducted over the years in many parts of the world has very conclusively demonstrated that deterrence or the punishment's deterrence actually does not work for drug consumption. Take example of bhang. Bhang is supposed to be not illegal in India. Still, 97% of Indians, they do not use bhang as per government's own statistics. Right? So ganja or charas are illegal, and 98% of Indians don't use them. 2% only use them. So in other words, keeping ganja and charas in the category of illegal or banned drugs and prosecuting, putting in jail people who use them has not really made much of a difference there. Or I will go even to the example of alcohol. Alcohol is legal in most parts of the country. Still, 85% of Indians do not drink alcohol. So to believe that once you do not have criminal sanctions for using these substances, then all youngsters will appear holding a chillum in their hands is really a misperception. So what we need to do is actually to, as you say, lenient. I would not say lenient. I would say it's a more rational, more humane approach where you do not see people who use drugs as criminals at all. You will have to, now the devil will lie there in detail, as Tripti was saying, to what extent, to what level that discretion would apply. Police catches someone in possession of small amount of drugs. To what extent then police can apply that description of whether to put this person in police custody, take him directly to a magistrate, or just take him to a doctor, to a hospital. That's what Portugal has done. Portugal has actually the prime example where they instituted a decriminalization system where people caught with small amount of drugs for personal consumption, they went to the health and welfare system and do not enter criminal justice system at all. So that is something I think which is very essential. I saw two very eminent experts discussing and debating the statistics of conviction and versus not non conviction in the NDPS Act. I would say whatever be the conviction rate, the punishment rates in NDPS Act are almost 100%, because the very process itself is a punishment. For a person who has caught with just one packet of ganja because he tried to experiment it, and because of that he had to spend a many few months in jail before coming out on bail, that itself is a punishment which he does not deserve. What he may deserve is some kind of health and welfare response, counseling, mental health support, education, and whatnot. And if the person is suffering from dependence, certainly requires treatment and rehabilitation. So the act of criminalizing consumption of some substances becomes a major hindrance in provision of health and welfare services to people affected by drug use and drug addiction. And that's, I think, it should be the first priority for us thinking about reforms. Thank you.
So decriminalizing consumers of drugs, whatever small percentage that you mentioned here, you believe would perhaps make healthcare more accessible, would allow for them to access rehabilitation more easily. But then I could also...
And along with it, it will take the focus away of our law enforcement agencies back to what matters more, that is going after the big level, the higher level of trade and trafficking. Right? Majority of cases booked under NDPS Act are for small quantities. So basically, people who consume drugs are the low-hanging fruits for the law enforcement agencies. They are easily visible, they can be caught, they can be put behind bars, and statistics of number of cases booked can improve. It does not do anything, as Tripti was saying, to the large-scale drug trade. Even if you catch small level of peddlers, you catch one and 10 people are ready to take their place.
Right. Dr. Vikram, you wanted to say something?
Yes, Arju, just one quick point. There are already nations that are reported to be international best practices. Take the example of Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and Dubai. They are said to be, of course, I do not agree with everything that their legislation has, but yes, they are said to be international best practices, but I have my own reservations. That again could be a possibility, but comparison should be between comparables. These are very small countries, and all the three countries would put into Uttar Pradesh, and India is a different ballgame altogether. Therefore, it has to have a different strategy. We have had a tradition of the consumption of opiates and other such substances. Therefore, our system and procedures will have to be customized for India. Thank you.
Right. So there seems to be the sense of perhaps binary or conflict with the healthcare approach to this problem versus the law enforcement approach to this problem. And Mr. Abhishek Mohan, you seem to be coming from a perspective of an economic approach to the entire issue, where there is a market also that exists out there, where perhaps regulation or legalization or leniency around the entire drug issue could bring in a new perspective of dealing with or catering with the drug problem. Now, since we also spoke about, the colonial impact on drug use, long back when the colonial masters were in our country, trade of drug use or trade of certain drugs was allowed. The opium trade was allowed, but the consumption was not allowed. So there was production still, there was regulation still, but the consumption of it, perhaps for recreational purposes, was not allowed. It was allowed for medical purposes. And in the present day and age, with the work that you are doing, it seems to me very similar to what the era was back then. So how is it any different?
With respect
to ease my question, to sort of simplify it, my question is that if we continue to regulate drug use purely from an economic perspective, if we let go of the healthcare perspective, of the law enforcement perspective that were brought up so far, do you think that could lead to a social acceptance of drug use, or will it still continue to compartmentalize it, leaving it only in an isolated bubble that will not solve the drug issue or the drug problems largely in the society?
I think the perspective that I came from really was how can we solve the problems of today in terms of healthcare, utilizing some of the medicinal benefits of so-called, I mean, now classified under narcotics, at scale, given that the law and order side of it will obviously take time to get to a level where there's a, where we're anything like Portugal or whatever else. But the idea was, how can we achieve that, the medical benefits at scale, given the current environment? And how do we do that is to do the extra work in self-regulation. It's to do the extra work in self-reporting. It's to do, to accept that, the people still, I mean, like I said, the chronic pain issue still needs to be solved. Like dysmenorrhea, some of the mass ailments we go after, these are mass ailments, they need to be solved. Cancer pain, there has to be an alternative. There has to be an alternative
Do you
to
believe
opioids.
using, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but do you believe using hemp or cannabis for these medical ailments would also pave way for recreational purposes? And do you support that? Do you support legalizing drugs for recreational purposes?
Well, the thing is, it's in how it's done. Like, I can only comment on what we are trying to achieve, right? I think the fact that it's federally legal for what we do, the fact that there has to be a certain level of responsibility. Like, I also touch upon the fact that where it's recreationally legal, I think it also comes down to the composition of it. Like, the THC levels in some recreational cannabis in the US is off the charts, right? So I think there's that level of sophistication that needs to come in, where it's responsibly dispensed, whether it's recreational, which I think is up for discussion, or it's medical. I think the idea is there has to be that infrastructure of responsible dispensation, because anything dispensed wrongly, like opioids, like, people say, okay, and I'm against opioids. I'm not. I think they're critical for people with for palliative care, for people with absolutely acute pain, but they shouldn't have been given to a mother of two with a back pain, and given in a quantity that she got addicted to it. So I think there are those, even in medical, while, I'm absolutely for everything being, whatever, liberalized for medical purposes, because it achieved, with clinical validation. But at the same time, even that needs to be done in a regulated, in a responsible mode of dispensation.
Right. And coming to this responsible mode of regulation, this is also a question open to the panel, but something that I've been thinking about, that so decriminalizing consumers who are taking these drugs is one side of the story. But do you think usage of drugs or consumers of drugs could also become potential criminals? Or they could be potential gullible youth that could be directed in manners through drug addiction to perhaps become antisocial elements of our day and age? And using the example of, say, certain areas of the Northeast or certain areas of Punjab, where the drug addiction is a real menace. And we see a rise in violence, a rise in crimes in these areas as well. So there is also the other side of the story, where criminalizing perhaps could decrease potential crimes in these areas. If Dr. Ambekar, I see you responding. Yes.
Yeah. That would really, I'm surprised that someone could come with this logic. That would be again putting our faith again in the belief that it is criminalizing these drugs which has kept their use in check. All statistics, all data show that drug use is actually increasing, right? So to say that it is that's how we have been able to keep it under check is really not a justifiable argument. And about this medical and recreational versus issue which Abhishek ji was saying, there is something which I want to again highlight, and which is a kind of argument which Tripti Tandon ji also makes very eloquently. I have heard her making that the line between what we call as medical and recreational use is not always clear. So do we call something as medical use only when it is manufactured and bottled by a corporation and sold to us, or a household consumption of a something? Does it not amount to medical use? After headache, we want to have a cup of coffee. Is it a medical use or is it recreational use of coffee? After cold and cough, people want to drink tulsi and adrak wali chai. Is it not a medical use of tulsi and adrak wali chai? Only when a company sells it, it becomes a medical use. And if people want to sort of take a substance to take care of their physical ailments, physical symptoms, what if they want to do the same for their mental symptoms as well? From that broad kind of perspective, the medical recreational may not always be a very, very clear distinction. So essentially, the idea is that we must be empathetic towards the human needs of using psychoactive substances for a variety of purposes. They may include frank medical, they may include the quasi medical or personally sort of health related usage, and the level of regulation you want to exercise there on various substances, that may differ. So there are clearly pharmaceutical products which can be regulated by like pharmaceutical industry regulations, and there can be other psychoactive substances like tea, coffee, or alcohol, which we allow to be regulated in a much more social manner.
Right.
I just want to comment on what you said and say that, we think that it's drugs that are causing harm to people, but I would say it's our response to drugs which is causing more harm, which is, someone smokes a joint, and now you don't even have to smoke a joint. You just send a message. Your WhatsApp chat has everything to do with drugs, and you find yourself in prison. We forget the harm that prisons are doing to our young people, to our population rather. We think that prison is a great place. Anyone who's been there can tell you it's not. And the damage that the prison and the criminal justice inflicts on people is just not talked about. It's just not acknowledged. So I would want to correct you here and say it's not really drugs, but it's our response to drugs that needs a change.
Right. And Mr. Vikram, you'd like to contribute? Yeah?
Yes, Arzu, I would like to contribute in the sense that there are certain things that need a course correction. Jail administration and jail inmates need a better deal. Investigation needs a better deal. We have had a very intellectually stimulating and highly philosophical and a theoretical and a practical debate. But I take you down to the level of a police station and an ordinary chowki of police chowki of India. But perhaps these ideas would be Greek and Latin, and I don't see them becoming intelligible in my lifetime. I do hope things change after my lifetime, but they need to change because such things are archaic and anachronistic. They have no place in a civilized society. Ms. Tandon has very rightly mentioned, sending a person to jail today is giving him a one-way ticket to mental challenge and psychiatric intervention and a nervous breakdown. If one has to see what hell is like, one doesn't have to die before his time. He just has to visit a jail and he will see what hell is like. And more often than not, people learn criminality and drug substance abuse when they go to the jails. Therefore, now we come to the system. I would like to bring to your notice, which you will not be privy to, sirs and Ms. Tandon, are you aware that when drug addicts are questioned by the police, there's a provision, illegitimate, that if there has to be a proper investigation, interrogation, they first will have to be given a basic amount of drugs so that the interrogation takes place and the investigation falls on active lines. Totally illegal and illegitimate. Nobody in the country has a right to do a thing like that because he commits the same crime for which he is questioning the person sitting across the table. But the ground reality is very different. And these are the things, these are horrible fault lines that need to be addressed. And how do you do it? Ms. Tandon has come out with very bold statements, revolutionary statements. Unfortunately, there are no alternatives. We have to take a different note, and I do hope the policy makers are listening to it. America is treading the path. Canada is, Israel is, Netherlands is, Mexico is. And are we falling behind in getting these reforms? This is a loud question.
And talking about these reforms, our conversation so far has been pretty focused on cannabis usage and more plant-based drugs. I would also like to expand perhaps the conversation and go into more synthetic or chemical-based drugs for that matter. Canada and Portugal, if I remember correctly, very recently have legalized possession of certain amounts of chemical drugs as well. And they direct these users now to healthcare services and rehab services instead of there being a criminal repercussion for the same. So how do you guys feel about that? Because there are very clear, very serious consequences for consumption of hard drugs or chemical drugs. Dr. Ambekar, if you could bring up the medical perspective here.
Yeah. So basically, first, the basic issue that we must appreciate the difference between legalization and decriminalization. Decriminalization means the product, the contraband, the substance itself remains banned, itself remains prohibited. But if you are caught consuming it or carrying it for your own personal consumption, you are not treated as a criminal. Someone who has sold it to you will still be sort of treated as a criminal. A very simple example being underage alcohol consumption in India. In most
Hmm.
states in India, there is a minimum legal drinking age of alcohol. If a person is caught consuming alcohol below their drinking age, that person does not go to jail. The person who has made alcohol available to the person, that person goes to jail, may go to jail. So that's
Hmm.
the actually the philosophy of decriminalizing, that the substance itself may remain banned. Now, about your point of being legally available, legal regulation, what most policy and criminal justice system experts across the world, after their research and review, have opined is responsible, stringent regulation is the best way to deal with all kinds of substances, rather than a very free market approach like alcohol or tobacco, which till very in the recent past, that is also
Hmm.
counterproductive for all substances, or a poorly regulated pharmaceutical industry, as Abhishek ji was telling us about US. That is also is not the way to go about. Neither the very stringent criminalizing consumption of cannabis and heroin and cocaine, which we have been doing, neither that helps. So a
Hmm.
middle path, which is the responsible regulation, perhaps is something the way to go about. And there also one can have some kind of gradation between different kinds of substances. For instance, looking at the research on harms across various substances. Researchers have actually estimated the level of harms caused by various substances, and the legal substances like alcohol and tobacco have turned out to be much way more harmful than cannabis. And that's the reason why many countries in the world are now relaxing their cannabis
Hmm.
laws and policies. So all
Hmm.
drugs need to be looked from the perspective of how much harm, how much damage they can cause, whether and if at all they should be banned or not, and if at all the banned, what should be the consequences of consuming them. That kind of fresh start is absolutely required, based upon the principles of scientific evidence base as well as human rights.
Right. Mr. Mohan, you want? Yeah.
So, if you look at the perception change, for example, most recently in psilocybin, like magic mushrooms or
Yeah.
MDMA, the more science that's acceptable, the more research that's publicly announced around it, also gives law enforcement and regulatory bodies a perspective that, you know what, the guys in lab coats are doing it. So, and it seems to be, and your hypothesis is that it helps with depression, or they've now seen that. Psilocybin helps in reducing massive alcohol dependence. That's the research that I'm reading about right now. So I think these kind of conversations of scientific validation are very pointed benefits, not like,
Hmm.
it's free for everybody to use. Perhaps it's a psychological condition that makes people addicts. That's not convincing enough for governments and people that are in the position to change law. But as more and more of these substances become accepted in research around healthcare, so you start to see a kind of a middle ground. And I think that's critically important. The fact that medical is the way to bring everybody to the table, to accept that, people achieve a certain benefit now if provided in a responsible, regulated manner in a medical form. And again, I stress medical is not because somebody like me or anybody from my industry manufactures something, even though it's great to have a GMP manufacturing facility and everything. It's the fact that it's dispensed by a medical practitioner who we also police. So I think the key is medical draws not by the fact that it's manufactured by a medical company. Even if it's a concoction that's mixed, it's responsibly
Hmm.
dispensed by a medical practitioner who we assume is operating ethically. And we also police to make sure they are. So I think so a lot of substances clearly, uh, you know, uh, I would say, just like the endocannabinoid system, a lot of substances are used as a compensatory method or something to alleviate a certain mental or physiological condition that a person suffers, addict, if you may call them. But they are trying to achieve, there's a reason why it's not it's not the availability, it's just that that sort of some kind of, I wouldn't use the word benefit, but benefit that they achieve. Now, if you can isolate that with research and say that, yes, MDMA and a certain, derivative of it helps with depression. Yes, psilocybin, I still don't know how to pronounce it properly, but magic mushrooms extract alleviates excess alcoholism. I mean, these are the hypotheses that you're reading about. I think that's a critical step. And then you start looking at users. I wouldn't, people trafficking and, the kingpins and all that, that's a different story. But then you start looking at users, even as a regulator, with much more empathy, because you are being explained in a scientific manner what benefits they are so-called chasing, right?
And this sort of a medical approach actually has been practiced in Himachal. It's been many years now that there's a task force running in Himachal Pradesh where the intention is to not immediately lock up people who are caught with possession of drugs, but then they are taken to these several local rehabilitation centers and they are given with proper counseling and they're told about the pros and cons and what all legal rights they have. But largely, the issue is that the state also does not have adequate facilities for that rehabilitation. Prisons are many. Rehabilitation centers are not enough at the moment. So many critiques of legalization or even decriminalization also argue of the cost of such a move. That can India even afford to legalize or to decriminalize such drugs at the moment? And Dr. Vikram, if you'd like to respond to that.
Certainly, Arzuji, the cost is stupendous and the path is circuitous and extremely difficult, if not impossible to meet. But let us make an honest beginning. It is not possible to get 100%. When we've not got 100%, we're talking, we've not even got 50% success. But an honest beginning, an intentional beginning in good faith, I'm sure the society really is waiting for this kind of an innovation. And it's time we started it. And that is what all these innovations are all about. Already, the best practices in the world are focusing in this direction. And it's time that we also started them. And being world leaders in so many things, it would be so wonderful to be a world leader and a pioneer in this also.
Ms. Tandon, would you like to add anything to that?
I want to just pick up on what Abhishek said. I think he makes a very important point about, exploring the full potential of some of these substances. I mean, cannabis, poppy, coca, these are plants. A plant is a gift of nature. A plant in itself cannot be evil. Unfortunately, our drug conventions have demonized plants, that the poppy plant is bad or the cannabis plant is bad. No. There are therapeutic, there are beneficial effects. And yes, there are certain effects that need to be guarded against. Where we have gone wrong is only one side, which is the abuse, the misuse, the addiction. While that needs to be taken care of in a humane, scientific, medical way, we cannot just ignore the good side of things, the good side that some of these substances offer. And exploring and opening up the research and medical frontiers is certainly a path to choose, but also just taking a break from this prohibition and draconian and more punishment, because as a lawyer I can tell you that doesn't work. And we see it every day in court. You have people accused of all kinds of heinous crimes, whether it's murder, whether it's rape, whether it's dowry death, all kinds of things. And when that person comes and asks for bail, the courts don't bat an eyelid. Judges don't bat an eyelid and say, okay, granted. But when it comes to someone accused of drugs, even if it's plain and simple ganja, which is not really deleterious, you just see, eyelids rolling, like, okay, this is some drug person and doesn't deserve, and then, the law. And I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's proportionate. And I don't think this is the right way to go.
I think it is also reflected.
Prohibition to be questioned and to be re-examined. I'm not sure what we will replace it with, but at least we need to question it.
And I think it's also reflective of the social taboo existing around people who are consuming drugs or around people who use it even for medical benefits for that matter. And perhaps a good way to start from is by acknowledging that we don't know enough yet. There is a lot of scope for medical research still. There is a lot of scope of perhaps international liaisoning in understanding that how are different countries approaching the war on drugs now, and how is it that India, with its very specific, with its very cultural specific positioning with regards to certain drugs, what stance should India be taking? And I think this is a conversation that needs to be happening repeatedly, not just in small forums like ours, but even at the government level or at institutional levels. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on the panel today. And if anyone would like to offer any closing remarks, just to close the conversation for tonight.
The status quo is not acceptable. That's, I think, should be the take-home argument. The nuances of what can be the alternative is something can be debated, but things simply cannot be allowed to go on like this, because then we are staring at a very bleak future ahead.
Well spoken, sir. There is thesis and there is antithesis, and from that should emerge synthesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for everyone who's watching, and we hope to continue talking about issues like these and many more at the Argumentative Indians. Thank you.